Let's read the book Enlightenment by Roy Porter. Chapter 2, The Birth of Ideology. The half-century after 1660 brought decisive transformation to British power politics and its clashing ideologies. Years of civil strife led to the beheading of the Lord's anointed Charles I on January 30th, 1649. The establishment of a republic, the abolition of the House of Lords and the bench of bishops, and to the rule of the major generals and Cromwell's doomed protectorate, events which draw the young John Locke to despair of this great Bethlehem in England. During the interregnum, England's traditional governors had been bruised and battered, as God's own nation was redeemed or ravaged by new model army specmen, chilistic preachers, and antinomian agitators advancing New Jerusalem schemes, which ranged from the communism of the diggers to renter free love. Hence, the audible relief at the Restoration. Quote, "Never so joyful a day," end quote, John Evelyn recorded in his diary the day Charles II rode into London. Quote, "I stood in the Strand and beheld it and blessed God." End quote. It was not only the king who hoped never again to have to go on his travels. The old political nation was bent on stabilization, and for many in the Cavalier Parliament, this meant vengeance. This means vengeance against and repression of those who had turned the world upside down, and as the 1662 fifth monarchist rising showed, had every intention of doing so again. Measures were passed to ram the laid back on. The Anglican Church was restored with its bishops, courts, and most of its privileges. Censorship was reimposed. The so-called Clarendon Code, the Corporation Act 1661, the Act of Uniformity 1662, the Conventicle Act 1662, the 5 Mile Act 1665, and the Test Acts 1661-1673 harassed non-Anglicans, curbing their rights to preach, teach, and hold office. The Act of Uniformity, for example, required all clergy and schoolmasters to subscribe to a declaration of conformity to the Anglican liturgy and to forswear these loyal oaths. The next decades saw the apogee of a divine right preaching and of royal thaumaturgical healing. Thomas Hobbes might be the devil incarnate, but he was hardly alone in looking to a mighty sovereign to end feuding and fanaticism. In some ways, the Restoration worked. Building on Cromwell's recent conquests overseas, trade prospered. The court exuded a large brilliance, and the merry monarch a winning charm, at least for those who had lost the Puritan zeal of the land business. Culturally and artistically, a dazzling half-century followed, with the work of Ryan, Gibbs, Lilly, Naylor, Purcell, and the dramas of Dryden, Opera Boone, Etheridge, Wycherley, Congreve, Van Brau, and Farquhar, while the Royal Society, chartered in 1662, promised to best the world in science. Restoring order, however, proved easier said than done. Interregnum England had grown fatally factionalized, and everyone had scores to settle. No realist could expect that the entire kingdom would now flock back into the Anglican fold. The court dallied with Catholicism, while many of the middling sort had put down sturdy sectarian roots, identity given permanence once the repressive Clarendon Code alienated even mainstream Protestant dissent. Politicians locked horns over law and liberty, the religious settlement, crown-parliament relations, and foreign alignments. As a commercial policy began to count for more to what was becoming a trading nation, and Louis XIV's militarism grew more threatening, discord deepened, and parties formed. Meanwhile, Charles was playing with fire. His Declaration of Indulgence, 1672, opportunistically suspended statutes against nonconformists and Catholics, a measure he was soon forced to rescind, but which inevitably deepened debates over the comprehension or the muzzling of dissent. A little before, he had acted treacherously in the secret clauses of the Treaty of Dover, 1670, by providing for England's conversion to Catholicism in return for the Sun King's gold, in a move meant to secure crown independence from Parliament. Smiling a rat, the more extreme Whigs, led by the Earl of Shaftesbury, fell to conspiracies, desperate at all costs to stave off re-Catholicization. This clouded the political nation. The succession of Charles II's Papist brother, James, was feared since it posed palpable threats to Protestantism, and hysteria was whipped up by the fabricated popish plot. Radical Whigs resorted to desperate measures in the exclusion crisis, backing the succession of the Duke of Monmouth, Charles's illegitimate but at least Protestant son. Spying was met by counter-espionage, accusation by counter-charge. After maneuvered, Shaftesbury fled, and his secretary, John Locke, joined him in exile. Radicals who, like them, found refuge in the Dutch Republic, that hotbed of dissidents, conspired with emigres from France, especially after Louis revocation of the Edict of Nantes, 1685, created a Huguenot diaspora which fed pan-Protestant paranoia. Contained in the twilight years of Charles' reign, crisis erupted after James II's accession in 1685. Monmouth's revolt ended ingloriously at Sedgemoor, but in the wake of that debacle, the arbitrariness of a royal repression alienated top politicians and bishops. Mighty aristocrats, urban corporations, and the universities. Natural conservatives temporarily found themselves bedfellows with hard heads in repudiating a regime contemptuous of legality and rights, one increasingly ruling through prerogative and smelling of popery. When James' consort, Mary of Modena, belatedly gave birth to a heir, spurious, according to the warming pan legend, events were triggered, which led to an invitation to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, to invade and eject James Stuart. Yet James' abdication in the bloodless, glorious revolution of November 1688 sparked as many problems as it solved. The Bill of Rights imposed upon Williams in the revolutionary settlement was a condition for his accession to the throne. Guaranteed regular parliaments, security of a person and property, broad tolerance for Protestants, and other freedoms. In effect, contrary to its own basic instincts, the political nation had been driven in the name of safeguarding rights and religion to pass measures which, at the Restoration, would certainly have been regarded as dangerously unsettling. Stuart folly, parliamentary factionism, and the fickleness of fate had brought about what proved an irreversible liberalization of the Constitution, one which most of the elite wanted to be final. Yet the journey was after the battle once again, as during the interregnum. The demons raised by James could not be silenced. Quite the reverse, the post-1688 political machinery was untried. Office was up for grabs. Allegiances were volatile, and the principles and the policies of William and Mary's regime became matters of raging controversy. Radical arguments repudiating divine rights and patriarchalism had been enunciated to rationalize first resistance to and then the expulsion of James. But by what title did William himself reign and rule? Had such a right been conferred upon him by the nation? If so, did that amount to popular sovereignty? If a Protestant wind had blown him to Toby in 1688, did Providence bless each and every victorious usurper? Could prelates who had broken their sacred oaths of allegiance to James than in conscience swear fealty to William? Moreover, 1688 could nowise be a final solution. Jacobite counter-coups long remained threatening. Orientalism dragged England into the World War against France, that finale of the wars of religion. William's strategic rapprochement with Protestant dissenters put the Church of England under ever greater strain, and religious tensions intensified with the arrival of some 80,000 Huguenot refugees. Fanning anti-Catholic panic, the pacification of Ireland, the cost of William's Grand Alliance wars, and the expansion of the executive and standing army further deepened divisions. If things cooled somewhat with the less controversial reign of Queen Anne, her own failure to produce a surviving heir reopened the succession sore. Questions of a principle, who was the legitimate successor, and on whose say-so, blame became inseparable from the jockeyings of Whigs and Tories to gain and retain the ever faster spoils of office. The post-1688 years hence brought the rage of party in a divided nation, split over the fundamentals of a church and state, king and parliament, Whig and Tory, high and low church, subject and citizen, satirized by Swift in terms of big and little enders. And all these controversies were occur amid momentous institutional and economic change at home, with the foundation of the Bank of England, 1694, the new money markets and the stock exchange, and the mushrooming of a fiscal military state, all against a backdrop of a ravaged, war-torn Europe, in which the Protestant cause sometimes seemed close to ruin at the hands of the dreaded Sun King. These times of crisis brought pamphlets, prints, and other propaganda galore from all sides and slants, penned by brilliant polemicists. It was this crescendo of a religio-political controversy from the 1680s that formed the catalyst of Enlightenment, unleashing volleys of polemics, damning tyranny, and priestcraft in the names of freedom, property, autonomy, and reason, advanced especially by these militant Whigs who formed the country's faction. To appreciate the momentous intellectual consequences of these developments, it would be helpful first to examine the radicalization of John Locke. Let me stop here for this episode.